Hello, my friends. Welcome back to the dreamscape of history. Before we begin, if this journey through the darker corners of the past resonates with you, consider subscribing, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I also love reading your comments, so please let me know where in the world you are and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin our long night in a place that is synonymous with beauty, with power, with absolute blinding luxury. The Palace of Versailles. Even the name sounds like gold. You can picture it, can't you? The hall of mirrors shimmering in the afternoon sun, the manicured gardens stretching out to the horizon, the silk gowns rustling over marble floors. It is the year 1682. King Louis XIV, the Sun King, has moved the entire French court from Paris to this gilded cage in the countryside. It is a masterpiece of Baroque architecture, a theatre of state where every moment is a performance. But if you were to actually step through those heavy gilded doors today, travel back in time and take a deep breath, you would not smell roses. You would not smell the crisp country air. You would smell something that would make your eyes water. You would smell a sewer. The history books often leave this part out. They show us the paintings, the statues, the fountains. They do not show us the reality of living in a building with 2,000 rooms, 4,000 servants, and 0 indoor plumbing. Versailles was, in essence, a beautiful, diamond-encrusted nightmare of hygiene. Imagine walking down one of those endless, echoing corridors. The walls are lined with velvet. The ceilings are painted with gods and cherubs, but as you walk, the air grows heavy, thick. There is a sharp, stinging scent of ammonia that hangs in the drapes. It clings to the tapestries. It seeps up from the floorboards. This is the smell of humanity packed too close together. The palace was built for spectacle, not for sanitation. There were no toilets, at least not in the way we understand them. There were no flushing pipes to carry waste away. There was only the chaise percée, a chair with a hole in the seat and a pot underneath, and these were reserved for the king and the highest nobility. For everyone else, the courtiers, the guards, the visitors trying to catch the king's eye, there was only the hallway, or a dark corner under a staircase, or, if they were polite, a chamber pot that might not be emptied for days.
Let us look closer at the daily life of a courtier in this golden prison. You wake up in a small, cramped room tucked away in the attic of the palace. It is freezing in the winter and stifling in the summer. You dress in layers of heavy silk, lace, and velvet. These clothes are never washed. They cannot be. Water would ruin the fabric, so you simply brush them and air them out. But the air you are exposing them to is already tainted. The palace is a closed system. Windows are rarely opened because drafts are feared more than the stench. So the air stagnates, it recycles. You leave your room and head toward the king's apartments. You have to watch your step. The corridors of Versailles were notorious. Servants, having nowhere else to go, would often relieve themselves in the corners. The sweepers would come through eventually, pushing the filth out into the courtyards, but the stone floors remained soaked. The smell was baked into the architecture. There are stories from foreign ambassadors visiting the court. They wrote home in horror. They described holding handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar to their noses just to be able to walk from one end of the gallery to the other. One visitor described the palace as the most magnificent and the most filthy place in the world. And then there was the issue of the water. Versailles is famous for its fountains, great jets of water shooting into the sky, controlled by a massive machine at Marly. But inside the palace, water was scarce. Bathing was considered dangerous, a health risk. The medical wisdom of the time said that hot water opened the pores, allowing disease to enter the body. So people didn't bathe. Louis XIV, the most powerful man in Europe, is said to have taken only 2 or 3 full baths in his entire life. Instead, hygiene was a matter of dry cleaning. You would rub your skin with a dry linen cloth. You would change your white linen shirt several times a day. If the linen was white, the logic went, then you must be clean. But linen cannot hide everything. Beneath the layers of gold braid and embroidery, bodies were sweating. Fungi were growing. Parasites were feeding. Lice were so common that they were simply accepted as part of the dress code. To scratch one's wig with a special, elegant rod was considered a normal, even polite gesture in conversation.
So how did they survive it? How did they conduct romance, politics, and dining in a place that smelled like a latrine? The answer lies in the heavy, cloying art of perfumery. If you cannot remove the smell, you must bury it, you must drown it. The French court became the centre of the perfume world, not out of vanity, but out of necessity. They used scents that were heavy, animalistic, and strong enough to fight the stench of decay. Musk, civet, ambergris. These were not light, floral sprays. These were thick oils derived from the glands of animals. The king loved orange blossom, but he also demanded that the entire palace be scented. Bowls of potpourri stood in every room. Scented sachets were sewn into the hems of curtains. Gloves were perfumed. Wigs were powdered with crushed orris root and lavender. When a lady walked past you, she didn't just leave a trail of scent. She created a cloud, a fog of heavy, powdery aromas designed to create a barrier between her and the world. It was an olfactory mask. But sometimes the mask slipped. In the summer heat, when the sun beat down on the slate roofs of the palace, the courtyards would cook. The cesspools beneath the palace, which often leaked into the foundations, would bubble up. The smell would become so overpowering that the king would be forced to cancel meetings and retreat to his other palaces, like Trianon, just to breathe. Even the gardens, those geometric masterpieces of Le Nôtre, were not safe. The beautiful hedges, perfectly clipped, served as convenient hiding spots for desperate courtiers who couldn't find a chamber pot. To take a romantic stroll in the gardens of Versailles was to navigate a minefield of human waste hidden amongst the tulips. It is a strange contrast, isn't it? We look at the portraits of these people, with their high wigs, their rouge, their diamonds, and we see elegance. But if we could step into the frame, the illusion would shatter instantly. We would see the dirt beneath the fingernails, we would see the lice crawling on the collar, and we would smell the truth, that the most glamorous place on earth, the centre of the civilized world, was actually a place of filth, a place where grandeur was just a thin layer of gold leaf painted over a rotting reality. And as the sun sets over the hall of mirrors, casting long shadows across the unwashed floor, we leave the Sun King to his perfumed misery and turn our attention to another, even more intimate royal duty. We leave the perfumed hallways of Versailles
and travel across the Channel back in time to the Tudor court of England, to a room that is small, private, and surprisingly crowded. We are stepping into the king's most intimate sanctuary, the withdrawing room. In the hierarchy of the royal court, everyone fights for proximity. To see the king is a privilege. To speak to him is an honor. To touch him is a career. But there was one man who touched the king more than his wife, more than his generals, more than his priest. This man held a title that sounds, to our modern ears, like a cruel joke. He was the Groom of the Stool. But do not laugh, do not look away in disgust, because in the 16th century, this was arguably the most coveted job in the entire kingdom. The sons of dukes and earls fought for this position. They bribed their way into it. Why? Because in the world of absolute monarchy, access is power, and nobody had better access than the man who helped the king relieve himself. Let us picture the scene. It is early morning. King Henry VIII is waking up. He is a large man, growing larger with age and indulgence. He does not go to a bathroom alone. He signals his need, and the Groom of the Stool steps forward. He carries the device that gives him his title, the stool. It is not a simple wooden box. It is a masterpiece of furniture. It is covered in crimson velvet, studded with gilt nails, and padded with down feathers. Inside, there is a pewter or ceramic basin. It is a portable throne for the most human of acts. The groom places it carefully. He assists the king with his heavy robes. He helps him sit, and then he waits. He stands there, right beside the monarch, in the quiet intimacy of the morning. There are no guards here, no shouting advisors, no foreign ambassadors, just two men and the silence. This silence was golden. It was in these moments, these vulnerable, unguarded minutes, that the real business of the kingdom was often conducted. Imagine the psychological power. The king is exposed. He is human. He is relaxed. If you wanted to ask for a favor, for a title, for a pardon, for a friend, this was the moment. The Groom of the Stool held the king's ear because he held the king's trust in his most private function. To the outsider, the job looks like servitude. It looks like humiliation. But to the court, it looked like dominance. While the rest of the nobility waited in the cold hallways just to bow as the king walked past, the groom was already inside, sharing the warmth, sharing the secrets, sharing the very air the king breathed.
But the job was not just about conversation. It was tactile, it was medical, and yes, it was dirty. When the king was finished, the groom's duty was not over. It was just beginning. In an era before toilet paper, the king required cleaning, and he certainly wasn't going to do it himself. That was the groom's most specific and most famous responsibility. He used a cloth, not just any rag, but pieces of fine linen or cotton, or sometimes even soft wool. These were heated by the fireplace so they wouldn't shock the royal skin. The groom would kneel. He would perform the cleansing. It was an act of extreme intimacy, an act of submission, yes, but also an act of reverence. The king's body was considered semi-divine. To touch it, even in this context, was a religious experience for some. It was a physical connection to God's anointed ruler. And then came the inspection. The groom didn't just empty the basin, he studied it. In the medieval and Renaissance world, medicine was based on the humours. Your health was visible in your waist. The royal physicians needed to know the texture, the colour, the smell. Was the king digesting his meat? Was there blood? Was there bile? The groom of the stool became the primary monitor of the royal health. He would report his findings to the doctors. "The king is bilious today," he might whisper, or "the royal passage was hard." These details were state secrets. If the king was constipated, the court panicked. If the king had dysentery, the stock market of political favours would crash. Because he knew the king's body so intimately, the groom knew the king's mood. He knew when Henry was in pain from his ulcerated legs. He knew when he was hungover. He knew when he was terrified of death. This knowledge made the groom dangerous. He became a gatekeeper. If a duke wanted to speak to Henry about a war with France, he would first go to the groom. "How is His Majesty this morning?" he would ask. And the groom would shake his head. "Not today, my lord. The stool was difficult." And a duke would walk away, knowing that a request made to a constipated king was a request denied. This strange, scatological influence extended to the king's finances as well. The groom eventually became responsible for the privy purse, the king's personal money. It makes sense, in a weird way. If you trust a man with your backside, you trust him with your wallet.
But as with all things in the court of Henry VIII, proximity to power carried a terrible risk. To be close to the sun is to be warm, but it is also to be burned. The groom knew too much. He heard the king's whispers about his wives. He saw the king's weakness. Take the story of Sir Henry Norris. He was a groom of the stool, a favourite, a man the king called my own eyes. He wiped the king. He laughed with the king. He managed the king's most private affairs. He was the ultimate insider. But when Henry turned against his wife, Anne Boleyn, he needed men to blame. He needed conspirators. And who better to accuse than the handsome, charismatic man who was always in the private chambers? Norris was accused of being Anne's lover. It was almost certainly a lie, but in the paranoia of the Tudor court, truth was irrelevant. Norris was arrested. He was pressured to confess. He refused, clinging to his honour. And so the man who had spent years caring for the king's most vulnerable moments was led out to Tower Hill. He was beheaded. His intimacy could not save him. In fact, his intimacy was likely what killed him. The king could not bear to look at a man who knew his secrets once the trust was broken. As the centuries passed, the role evolved. The stool became less about the actual pot and more about the dressing. The groom became the groom of the stole, referring to the king's robes. The dirty work was eventually handed down to lesser servants. The intimacy faded. By the Victorian era, the idea of a nobleman wiping the monarch's bottom was unthinkable. It became a historical embarrassment, a dirty joke. But for hundreds of years, it was the pinnacle of ambition. So, the next time you close the bathroom door and enjoy the solitary privacy of that moment, remember the grooms, remember the men who fought for the right to stand in that room, who saw the king not as a legend, but as a man on a box. They teach us a strange lesson about history. That power is not just about armies or laws or golden crowns. Sometimes power is simply being the one person in the room when the king is at his most human. We leave the Tudor court now. We leave the velvet stool and the heavy linen cloths. We step away from the specific ritualized hygiene of the king and we widen our view. We look at the rest of the world. The common people, the knights, the merchants. How did they stay clean in a world without plumbing?
The answer is more complex and more surprising than you might think. We step away from the velvet-lined box of the king's stool, and we walk out into the mud of a medieval street. There is a common belief about this time, a myth that we have all accepted as fact. We think the Middle Ages were universally filthy. We imagine that every peasant, every knight, and every merchant walked around in a cloud of their own stench, never bathing from birth until death. But the truth, as it often is in history, is stranger and more complicated. The people of the past were not fond of being dirty. They did not enjoy smelling of sweat and grime any more than you do. They simply had different battles to fight. Imagine you are a medieval labourer. It is dawn. You have slept in your clothes because it is cold. You wake up. You do not have a shower. You do not have a tap. You have a basin of water, if you are lucky, and a piece of cloth. The foundation of hygiene was not water, it was linen. We saw this with the king, but it applied to everyone. Your undergarment, the chemise or smock, was the most important piece of technology you owned. It was made of linen because linen has a specific property. It is absorbent. It wicks the oil and sweat away from your skin. To be clean meant to change your linen. If you were rich, you changed it every day. If you were poor, you changed it when you could. But you scrubbed your skin with it. This was dry washing. The friction of the rough fabric against the skin was believed to scrape away the impurities. It was exfoliation as a way of life. You would wash your face and your hands. These were the visible parts, the parts of honour. To sit at a table with dirty hands was a social sin. Before a meal, a servant or a family member might pour water from a jug over your hands. In a wealthy house, this jug might be an aquamanual, a brass vessel shaped like a lion or a griffin. In your cottage, it is just an earthenware pitcher. But the ritual is the same. You wash away the world before you break bread. But what about the rest of the body? What about the deep clean? For that, you had to leave the house. You had to go to the stews.
The public bathhouse was a staple of the medieval city. It was a place of steam, wood, and naked humanity. Imagine walking into a long, low-ceilinged room. The air is thick with humidity. It smells of wood smoke, heating the great copper cauldrons of water and of herbs. To fight the smell of unwashed bodies, the water was often infused. Musk, rose leaves, chamomile, and other aromatic plants were thrown into the tubs. It was a desperate attempt to create a spa atmosphere in a world of mud. You pay your penny, you strip off your heavy woolens, and you climb into a large wooden tub. It is essentially a half barrel. Sometimes you are alone. Often you are not. People bathed together. They sat in the warm water, scrubbing each other's backs, drinking wine and eating food on wooden planks laid across the tub rims. It was a social event. Business deals were struck here. Gossip was exchanged. In the flickering candlelight, with the steam rising around you, the strict social hierarchies of the outside world softened slightly. A merchant and a knight might sit in adjacent tubs, both equally naked, both equally vulnerable. But the soap they used, that was a different story. It was not the scented, gentle bars we have today. It was soft soap, a gelatinous grey sludge made from animal fat, tallow, mixed with wood ash and lye. It was harsh. It could burn the skin if left on too long, and it smelled of rendered fat. You were essentially washing yourself with caustic grease. But it worked. It stripped the dirt, it killed the lice, and afterwards you felt new. But there was a danger in the bathhouse. As the centuries wore on, the church began to frown upon them. They were seen as places of sin, places where nakedness led to other things. And then the plague came. The medical wisdom shifted. Suddenly, hot water was the enemy. They believed the steam opened the pores, creating a gateway for the pestilence to enter the body. The bathhouses closed, the tubs were broken down, and Europe entered a darker, dirtier age where water was feared and the linen shirt became the only barrier against the filth.
And then there is the laundry. If the linen shirt is your shield, you have to keep it clean. But how do you bleach fabric white in the year 1300? You do not have chlorine. You have urine. Yes, chamber lye, old, stale urine. It contains ammonia. It is a powerful bleaching agent. It removes grease stains. In the medieval village, urine was a resource. It was collected. It was saved in pots. The washerwomen, laundresses, had one of the hardest jobs in society. They would take the dirty linens down to the riverbank. They would soak them in a mixture of water and urine, and then they would stomp on them or beat them with wooden paddles called beetles. Imagine the smell, the ammonia rising in the heat of the day, the physical labor of beating heavy, wet cloth for hours. It was grueling, but the result was pristine white linen. The ammonia evaporated as the clothes dried in the sun, leaving them fresh. It is a strange paradox, using waste to create purity. Finally, we must look at the mouth, the medieval smile. We assume everyone had rotten teeth, and while sugar was rare, the grit from the stone-round bread wore teeth down to stumps. But they tried. Oh, they tried. They did not have toothbrushes. They had toothcloths, rough pieces of linen that you would rub vigorously over your gums and teeth to scour away the plaque. They used powders made of burnt rosemary, charcoal, or even crushed cuttlefish bone. Abrasive, gritty, but effective at polishing. To freshen the breath, they chewed on fennel seeds, or parsley, or cloves. They rinsed their mouth with vinegar and wine. But if a tooth rot, if the pain came, there was no saving it. They believed the pain was caused by a toothworm, a tiny demon gnawing at the root. The cure? You go to the barber. He takes a pair of iron pliers. There is no numbing, no injection, just a strong man holding your head and a sharp, cracking sound. The tooth is gone, the worm is banished, and you are left with a gap in your smile and the taste of blood and vinegar in your mouth. So, they were not dirty because they didn't care. They were clean in the only ways they knew how. They scrubbed with linen, they bleached with urine, they scraped with charcoal. It was a hygiene of survival, a hygiene of harsh substances fighting a harsh world. And now, as we leave the steam of the bathhouse and the smell of the riverbank, we move from the cleaning of the body to the resting of it. We travel further back in time to the greatest empire of them all, Rome, where the nights were noisy, the beds were hard, and the pillows were made of stone.
We leave the scrubbing of the medieval gums and the steam of the bathhouse. We travel further back, 2,000 years into the past, to the heart of the eternal city, Rome.
We imagine Rome as a place of order, of white marble, clean lines and disciplined legions. But if you were to stand in the Subura district at midnight in the 1st century AD, you would not find peace. You would find chaos. Ancient Rome was the original city that never slept, not because of nightlife or parties, but because of the law. Julius Caesar, tired of the gridlock in the narrow streets, banned wheeled traffic from the city centre during the daylight hours. It was a brilliant solution for the day, but a curse for the night. As soon as the sun set, the carts began to roll, thousands of them, bringing grain, wine, olive oil and stone for the emperor's monuments. The iron-rimmed wheels crashed against the basalt paving stones. The drivers shouted, the oxen bellowed. The noise was deafening. The poet Juvenal, a man who clearly needed a nap, wrote that insomnia causes more deaths amongst Roman invalids than any other factor. He claimed that only the rich can sleep in Rome. And he was right, because most Romans lived in insulae, apartment blocks. These were towering, rickety structures, sometimes 6 or 7 stories high. They were built cheap and built fast. The walls were thin. If your neighbor rolled over in bed, you heard it. If the couple upstairs had an argument, you were part of it. So, how did you sleep in this cacophony? You retreated to a room that was often little more than a cell, a cubiculum. The word gives us our modern cubicle. It was small, dark, and usually windowless to keep out the noise and the heat. You climb into bed, the lectus. It is a high wooden frame, often so high you need a small stool to climb up into it. It has webbing made of leather straps or rope. On top of this sits the mattress. If you are poor, it is stuffed with hay, or dry leaves, or reeds. It crackles when you move. It smells of the field, and, inevitably, it is full of bugs. If you are rich, a patrician, your mattress is stuffed with wool, or the finest goose feathers from Germania. But even then, comfort is relative. The Roman bed was not a place to sink into. It was firm, unyielding. It was designed to keep the spine straight, to encourage discipline, even in slumber.
Now, we come to the pillow, or the lack thereof. In many ancient cultures, the pillow as we know it, a soft, fluffy cloud for the head, was seen as unnecessary or even weak. While wealthy Romans did have cushions, the pulvinus, they were often packed tight with straw or cotton. They were hard bolsters, cylindrical and firm. They didn't cradle the head, they propped it up. Why? Vanity and virtue. For the Roman matron, with her elaborate, towering hairstyle held in place with bone pins and beeswax, a soft pillow was a disaster. It would crush the curls. It would ruin hours of work by her slaves. So she slept on a hard bolster, resting her neck carefully on the ridge, leaving her hair floating in the air. She sacrificed comfort for beauty, sleeping stiffly, afraid to move. For the Roman man, particularly those who followed the Stoic philosophy, softness was the enemy of the character. To sleep on too soft a bed was to become soft in the mind. The ideal was to be ready, alert. A soldier sleeping in the field uses his shield, or a rock, or his own arm. To replicate that hardness at home was a sign of toughness. So, you lie there, on your hay mattress, your neck propped on a hard ridge of linen-wrapped straw. The wagons thunder outside, the floor vibrates, and you wait for sleep. But sleep, when it comes, is not a continuous 8-hour block.
Just like the medieval peasants, the Romans practiced segmented sleep. They went to bed early when the lamps ran out of oil. They slept until midnight. Then they woke. This period, the watch, was different in Rome. It was a time for study. The statesmen, the writers, the thinkers, they cherished these quiet hours before the wagons reached their peak volume. They would light a small oil lamp, they would read scrolls, they would write letters. The Emperor Augustus was known to wake up after his first sleep, call for his secretaries, and dictate laws while the rest of the palace snored. It was accepted that the night was broken, that consciousness was fluid. You slept, you woke, you thought, you slept again.
But there is a darker side to the Roman night, a fear that kept the sleeper from relaxing fully: fire. The unsulae were tinder boxes, wood frames, wooden furniture, oil lamps burning in every room, open braziers for heating. It only took one tipped lamp, one spark, and the whole block would go up. There were no fire escapes, no sprinklers. If you lived on the top floor, which was the poorest floor, the cenaculum, you were trapped. So you slept with one ear open, listening not just for the wagons, but for the crackle of flame, for the smell of smoke. The fear of burning alive was a constant, low-level anxiety that permeated the dreams of the city. And if the fire didn't get you, the intruders might. Roman locks were primitive. Theft was common. A man sleeping in a cubiculum might keep a gladius, a short sword, or a heavy stick under the bed. He slept defensively. So, picture the Roman sleeper. He is not the relaxed figure we see in movies, sprawled on grapes and silk. He is tense. He is tired. He is propped up on a hard bolster, listening to the roar of traffic, the shouting of drivers, the creaking of the timber walls. He is fighting a battle for rest in a city designed to prevent it. When the sun finally rises, bringing the second sleep to an end, he does not linger. He gets up immediately. There is no hitting the snooze button. The Roman day starts at dawn. He wraps his toga, a heavy, cumbersome woolen sheet, around his body. He splashes water on his face, and he steps out of the dark, cramped cell and into the blinding white light of the forum. He is tired, his neck is stiff, his eyes are gritty, but he is a Roman, and Romans do not complain about the hardness of the bed. They conquer the day regardless. And now, as the sun rises over the 7 hills, we leave the noisy streets of Rome. We leave the hard beds and the sleepless nights. We turn our attention to the body itself, to the fragile vessel that must endure the cold, the dirt, and the lack of sleep. What happens when that body breaks? What happens when the pain becomes too much? We enter the terrifying, silent world of the pre-anesthetic surgeon. We leave the cramped apartment blocks of Rome, and we step forward in time into a room that is quieter, colder, and infinitely more terrifying. It is the operating theatre of the Middle Ages. To us, surgery is a sterile miracle. You lie down on a soft bed. A mask is placed over your face. You count backwards from 10, 9, 8, 7, and then oblivion. You wake up in a recovery room, groggy but painless. The trauma has happened without you witnessing it. But in the year 1200 or 1400, surgery was not a science of sleep. It was a trial of endurance. Anesthesia as we know it, ether, chloroform, gas, did not exist.
Pain was not a variable to be removed. It was a constant. It was the wall you had to climb to get to the other side of life. Imagine you have a shattered leg, or a gangrenous arm, or a stone in your bladder that feels like a razor blade every time you move. You have tried the prayers. You have tried the poultices of dung and herbs. Nothing has worked. You have no choice left. You must visit the surgeon. He is not a university man. He is not a doctor in fine robes who studies the stars and urine charts. He is a craftsman, a barber surgeon. He cuts hair in the morning, and he cuts bone in the afternoon. His shop smells of stale blood, sawdust, and vinegar. You walk in. The room is dimly lit. In the center, there is a table, a heavy oak plank scarred by the knives of 1,000 procedures. There are leather straps attached to the sides, heavy buckles stained with sweat and fear. The surgeon greets you. He is wearing an apron that is stiff with old fluids. He does not wash his hands. In fact, he believes the laudable pus, the creamy white infection that often follows a cut, is a sign of healing. He lays out his tools. They look like the contents of a carpenter's workshop: a saw with jagged teeth, a curved knife shaped like a sickle, a pair of heavy iron pliers. A glowing brazier of coal stands nearby, heating iron rods until they are cherry red. These are the cautery irons. They are your only protection against bleeding to death. You look at the tools, you look at the table, and your heart hammers against your ribs like a trapped bird. You know that in a few minutes you will experience a level of pain that is beyond language, a pain so absolute that it shatters the mind. But you have to go through it, because the alternative is death.
But surely they had something, some way to dull the edge of the agony. They tried. Oh, they tried. The history of pre-modern anesthesia is a history of desperate experiments. The most famous was the spongia somnifera, the sleeping sponge. It sounds almost gentle. A sea sponge, soaked in a dark, potent brew, opium from the poppy, mandrake root, hemlock, hyoscyamus. It was a cocktail of narcotics and poisons. The sponge was dried in the sun, and then, just before the surgery, it was dipped in hot water and held over the patient's nose and mouth. "Breathe," the surgeon would say. "Breathe deep." The fumes would rise, heavy, sweet, cloying. If you were lucky, the room would start to spin. Your limbs would feel heavy. The sharp edge of your fear would dull into a foggy confusion. You might drift into a semi-conscious stupor. But it was a dangerous gamble. Too little, and you felt everything. Too much, and the hemlock stopped your heart. Many patients went to sleep under the sponge and simply never woke up. The surgeon had to balance the risk of pain against the risk of poison. If the sponge was unavailable or considered too risky, there was alcohol, brandy, wine, ale. You would drink until you couldn't stand, until the world blurred. But alcohol is a traitor. It thins the blood. It makes the heart pump faster. It makes the bleeding worse. A drunk patient bleeds out faster than a sober one. So, for the most part, the only true anesthetic was speed. The surgeon's greatest skill was not precision, it was velocity. A good surgeon could amputate a leg in under 3 minutes. Think about that. 180 seconds. You are lifted onto the table. The strong men, assistants chosen for their muscle, grab your arms and legs. They do not hold your hand. They pin you down. They put their entire weight on you because when the knife touches the skin, The body will react. It will thrash. It will fight. It is pure animal instinct. You are given a piece of leather to bite down on, or a stick of wood. This is not a movie trope. This is to stop you from biting off your own tongue when the scream tries to escape. The surgeon nods. The assistants tighten their grip, and the knife descends.
The first cut is the skin. It is sharp, burning, electric. But then comes the muscle. The knife slices deep, severing the fibers. You cannot faint. The adrenaline is pumping so hard, your system is so shocked that you are hyper-aware. You hear the wet sound of the blade. You smell the copper scent of your own blood filling the air. And then, the saw. The sound of a saw on human bone is something that, once heard, is never forgotten. It is a dry, grating rasp, a vibration that travels up the skeleton and rattles the teeth. The surgeon works furiously. Sweat drips from his brow onto the wound. He is sawing through your leg as if it were a piece of firewood. He has to. Every second of delay is a second of shock. Finally, the limb falls away, but the ordeal is not over. The arteries are spurting. Life is leaving you in bright red jets. The surgeon turns to the brazier. He pulls out the iron. It glows with a malevolent orange heat. He presses it against the raw stump. Hiss. The sound of wet meat hitting hot metal. The smoke rises immediately. Thick, greasy, the smell of burning flesh fills the small room, overpowering the vinegar, overpowering the blood. The pain of the burn is different from the cut. It is a searing, all-consuming fire that blinds you. And then it is done. The bleeding stops. You are untied. You are carried to a bed of straw. You are alive. You have survived the torture. But now you must survive the aftermath. There are no antibiotics. The wound is dressed with old rags or perhaps a salve made of honey and grease. The laudable pus will come. The fever will come. Many survived the table only to die 3 days later of hospital gangrene, their body consumed by the invisible life on the surgeon's unwashed hands. It requires a specific kind of courage to live in the past. We think of ourselves as tough, but we panic when the Wi-Fi goes out. These people, our ancestors, walked into that room, saw the saw, saw the fire, and climbed onto the table anyway. They endured the unendurable. So the next time you sit in a dentist's chair, and you feel the tiny sharp prick of the Novocaine needle, do not wince, do not complain. Close your eyes and say a silent thank you to the ghosts of the barber surgeons and the millions of screams that echoed in the dark before the invention of the silent sleep. We leave the blood-stained apron behind. We leave the realm of the living body, and we turn our gaze to the dead. But in the Victorian era, the dead did not always stay buried. Sometimes they were dug up. Sometimes they were ground into powder. And sometimes, believe it or not, they were eaten for lunch.
We step out of the surgeon's blood-stained room and we travel forward again to an era that prided itself on civilization, on science, on propriety. The Victorian age. A time of stiff collars, high tea, and industrial progress. But beneath the polite veneer of Victorian society, there lay a strange and macabre hunger. We are standing in a high-end apothecary shop in London. It is lined with mahogany shelves, glass jars filled with colourful liquids, and the smell of dried herbs and wax. A wealthy gentleman walks in. He complains of a headache, or perhaps a stomach ailment, or maybe he just feels a lack of vitality. The apothecary nods sagely. He reaches for a jar on the top shelf. It is labeled with a strange word, mumia. He takes a pinch of the brown, dusty powder inside. He mixes it into a glass of wine, or perhaps rolls it into a pill with some honey. The gentleman pays a handsome sum. He drinks it. He feels better. He believes he has consumed a potent medicine. But he hasn't. He has consumed a person. This is one of the darkest and most bizarre chapters in medical history. For centuries, peaking in the 16th and 17th centuries, but lingering right into the Victorian era, the elite of Europe practiced a polite form of cannibalism. They ate Egyptian mummies. It sounds like a Gothic horror story, but it was mundane reality. The King of France, Francis I, never travelled without a pouch of mummy powder. The philosopher Francis Bacon recommended it for healing bruises. Even Shakespeare mentions it. How did this happen? How did the most civilized nations on earth convince themselves that eating the desiccated flesh of ancient Egyptians was a good idea? It started, as many tragedies do, with a translation error. The Persian word mumia referred to bitumen, a black, tar-like substance found seeping out of Mummy Mountain in Persia. It was used to treat broken bones and wounds. It was rare and it was valuable. But when Europeans began encountering Egyptian mummies, they saw the blackened, resin-coated bodies. They looked like bitumen. They smelled like bitumen. And so the traders, seeing a profit, said, "Yes, this is the same thing." The word shifted from the substance to the body. And suddenly the demand for mumia exploded. But there wasn't enough natural bitumen to go around, so they started grinding up the mummies. Imagine the scene in the dusty streets of Cairo. Tomb robbers breaking into the sacred resting places of the pharaohs and priests. They didn't just steal the gold, they stole the occupants. They dragged the bodies out into the sun. They stripped them of their linen wrappings, and they sold them by the pound, like dried fish, like grain. The bodies were shipped to Europe, to Venice, to London, to Paris. They were pulverized in mortars, ground into a fine aromatic dust, and then sold to the aristocracy as a cure-all.
But the obsession went deeper than just a translation error. There was a mystical logic to it as well. The Victorians and their ancestors believed in vitalism, the idea that the body contained a spiritual life force. They looked at the mummies. These bodies had lasted for 3,000 years. They had defied decay. They had cheated time. Surely, the reasoning went, they must be filled with a potent energy. If you ate the preserved flesh, you could absorb that longevity. You could take the strength of the ancients into your own blood. It was a form of sympathetic magic disguised as medicine. The king eats the king. It was thought that the higher the status of the mummy, the better the medicine. So, people claimed they were selling pharaohs. In reality, they were often selling commoners. Or even, in the darker corners of the trade, the bodies of executed criminals or slaves, dried in the desert sun and passed off as ancient. But the Victorians didn't just eat them. They turned them into entertainment. Picture a rainy Tuesday evening in a London townhouse. The gas lamps are flickering, the fire is roaring. A group of well-dressed guests is gathered in the drawing room. They are drinking sherry, they are chatting about politics. And in the centre of the room, on a long table, lies a body. This is a mummy unrolling party.
It was the height of social fashion. A host would purchase a mummy at an auction, invite their friends over, and slowly, layer by layer, unwrap the linens. It was a striptease of death. As the bandages came off, the guests would gasp. They would lean in to smell the ancient spices. They would touch the dried skin. They would look for amulets or jewelry tucked into the wrappings. It was treated as science, as archaeology, but underneath it was a morbid voyeurism, a fascination with the dead that bordered on the obsessive. When the unrolling was done, the mummy was often left there, a curiosity, a decoration, or, if the condition was poor, it was sent to the kitchen to be ground up for the medicine cabinet. It is hard for us to reconcile this. The same people who fainted at the mention of a leg of a table because it was too suggestive would happily stand around a corpse in a parlour poking it with their walking sticks. It shows us that our relationship with death is fluid. To them, the mummy wasn't a person. It was an object, a commodity, an artifact.
The consumption of mummies didn't stop at medicine. It infiltrated art. If you walk through a museum today and look at a beautiful, romantic painting from the 19th century, take a close look at the shadows, the rich, warm browns, the deep, transparent glazes that give the painting its depth. That color is likely mummy brown. Yes, paint manufacturers ground up mummies to make pigment. It was a favorite of the pre-Raphaelites. It had a transparency and a texture that no other brown could match. It was, literally, the color of death. Thousands of mummies were processed into tubes of paint. An artist might be painting a scene of life and love and beauty, using the remains of a priest who lived 3 millennia ago. The practice only stopped when the supply ran out and when the artists finally realized what they were doing. There is a famous story of the artist Edward Burne-Jones. When he was told that his tube of mummy brown was actually made of, well, mummy, he was horrified. He insisted on giving the tube of paint a Christian burial in his garden. It seems funny to us, but it marked the end of an era, the moment when the mummy shifted back from being a material to being a human. Eventually, the medical use faded too. Science advanced. We discovered bacteria. We discovered that eating dead bodies was, generally speaking, a terrible idea. The jars of mumia disappeared from the shelves. The unrolling parties stopped. The mummies were moved from the drawing room to the museum case. But the dust of those ancient people is still with us. It is in the paintings hanging on the walls. It is in the medical history books. It is a reminder of a time when our hunger for life, for health, and for longevity led us to consume the very past we were trying to preserve. We leave the dusty, spice-scented air of the apothecary shop. We leave the glass jars and the unrolled linens. We move from the consumption of the body to the punishment of the body. We travel to a place of sweat and endless repetitive motion, to a machine that you might recognize from your local gym. But in the 19th century, it wasn't for fitness, it was for torture. We leave the quiet, dusty world of the Victorian drawing room and the strange taste of mummy powder. We move to a place that is colder, harder, and filled with a rhythmic grinding sound that never stops. We are entering the Victorian prison. Specifically, we are standing in the courtyard of Coldbath Fields Prison in London. The year is 1818. The sky is grey, reflecting the high stone walls that cut the inmates off from the world. It is a place of silence. The separate system is in effect here. Prisoners are forbidden to speak to one another. They are forbidden to look at one another. They are ghosts in uniform. But there is a sound, a low, rhythmic thrumming, like a giant heart beating slowly. Thump, squeak, thump, squeak. We turn the corner and see it, a massive machine. It looks like a water wheel, 20 feet long, stretching across the yard. But it is not turned by water. It is turned by men. 20 prisoners stand side by side. They are gripping a wooden handrail at chest height. Their feet are moving in unison. They are stepping up, and up, and up. But they are going nowhere. The wheel spins beneath them. As one step goes down, another rises to meet their foot. It is an everlasting staircase. This is the treadmill. Today you might see a treadmill in a brightly lit gym. You might see people running on it, listening to music, checking their heart rate, paying a monthly membership for the privilege of sweating. It is a symbol of health, of vitality, of self-improvement. But here, in the 19th century, it was a device of torture. It was designed by a civil engineer named Sir William Cubitt. He looked at the idle prisoners, sitting around, doing nothing, and he felt it was a waste. He believed in the redemptive power of hard work. But not just any work. He wanted work that was difficult, monotonous, and ultimately pointless. He designed the treadwheel to crush the spirit. The prisoners were not walking on a flat belt. They were climbing. Imagine climbing a ladder that never ends. For 6, 7, sometimes 8 hours a day. The wheel had a fan attached to it to provide resistance. Sometimes it ground grain. Sometimes it pumped water. But often it did nothing at all. It just spun large paddles through the air to create drag. This was called grinding the wind. The prisoners hated it more than the whip. They hated it more than the dark cells. Because at least in a dark cell, you could think. On the wheel, you could only step. Left foot, right foot, left foot. The rhythm erased the mind. It turned the man into a cog, a biological component of a wooden machine.
Let us step closer to the machine. You can hear the breathing of the men. It is ragged, desperate. The physical exertion required to move the wheel is immense. Historians have calculated the energy output. In a typical shift, a prisoner would climb the equivalent of over 8,000 feet. That is like climbing halfway up Mount Everest every single day on a diet of stale bread and gruel. The physical toll was catastrophic. Men collapsed, their legs gave out, and the machine, indifferent to their suffering, kept spinning. If you slipped, the wooden steps would batter your shins. If you fell, you could be crushed underneath the mechanism. But the real cruelty was the monotony. The Victorians believed that crime was a result of a disorderly mind. Therefore, the cure was extreme order, repetition. The treadmill enforced a silence so total, a routine so rigid, that it was meant to grind the rogue honest. The men stood in partitions, little wooden stalls that prevented them from seeing the man next to them. They stared at a blank wall, inches from their face, for hours.
There was nothing to look at, nothing to hear but the creak of the wood and the shuffle of boots. Oscar Wilde, the famous poet and playwright, was imprisoned in Reading Gaol in the 1890s. He walked the treadmill. He described it as a nightmare of apathy. He wrote, "We banged the tins and bawled the hymns and sweated on the mill. But in the heart of every man, terror was lying still." The mill broke him. It broke his health. It broke his spirit. He entered prison a flamboyant, witty celebrity. He left a broken man who died shortly after. The treadmill didn't just punish the body, it exhausted the soul. It took the act of walking, the most basic human freedom, and turned it into a cage. And yet, the public loved it. It was a tourist attraction. Respectable Victorian families would visit the prisons on weekends to watch the men on the wheel. They stood on viewing platforms, watching the rows of convicts stepping endlessly. They nodded in approval. To them, it looked like justice. It looked like a machine that was turning sin into sweat. But inside the prison, it was just pain. The prisoners developed the specific gait, a treadmill stoop. They walked with their bodies leaning forward, their hands gripping an invisible rail, even when they were released. The machine stayed with them. It rewired their muscles. It rewired their minds to expect a floor that was always falling away beneath them.
Eventually, even the Victorians, with their stiff upper lips and love of discipline, decided it was too much. Reports of deaths, of hernias, of men driven mad by the futility of the labour began to circulate. The Prisons Act of 1898 finally recognised that useless labour was cruel. The treadmills were slowly dismantled. The great wooden wheels were broken down for firewood, the metal gears were melted for scrap. By the early 20th century, the everlasting staircase had vanished from the penal system. Silence returned to the courtyards, but it was a different kind of silence. The grinding had stopped. But the idea, the mechanism, did not die. It merely slept. In the 1960s, a new obsession began to rise. Aerobics, jogging, the sedentary lifestyle of the modern office worker created a new problem. We weren't moving enough. We needed a way to run without going outside, to walk without leaving the room. And so the engineers looked back. They looked at Cubit's design. They flattened the wheel into a belt. They added a motor to help rather than hinder, and they brought the treadmill back. But this time, it wasn't a punishment, it was a privilege. We pay for it. We buy expensive clothes to wear while we do it. We stare at screens instead of blank walls, but the motion is the same. We step and we go nowhere. There is a strange irony in this. If you could show a Victorian convict a modern gym, he would think he was looking at a torture chamber. He would see rows of people, sweating, gasping, running on machines that never end. He would ask, what crime did they commit? And you would have to explain, no, they chose this. They do it for fun. They do it to live longer. He would not understand. To him, the wheel was the thief of life. To us, it is the giver of it. So, the next time you step onto a treadmill and you press the start button and you hear that familiar hum of the belt beginning to move, take a moment to remember. You are walking in the ghostly footsteps of Oscar Wilde. You are walking on a machine designed to crush the will. Feel the rhythm. Left foot, right foot. It is the same rhythm that echoed off the stone walls of Cold Bath Fields. The machine has changed its purpose, but it hasn't changed its nature. It is still the wheel of silence, It is still the grind. But tonight, you can step off whenever you want. And that, my friends, is the greatest luxury of all. We leave the sweating prisoners and the echoing yard. We leave the world of physical punishment. We move now to a quieter, stranger obsession. The Victorians didn't just punish the living, they were obsessed with the dead. And more specifically, they were obsessed with keeping images of them. We are entering the silent parlour, where a photographer is setting up his camera, but his subject is not breathing.
We leave the grinding noise of the treadmill and step into a room that is silent. Perfectly, unnervingly silent. The air smells of sharp chemicals, ether, collodion, and lavender water. We are in a photographer's studio in London around 1860. The room is cluttered with velvet drapes, ornate chairs, and painted backdrops of Greek ruins or pastoral gardens. A large wooden camera stands on a tripod in the center of the room. Its glass lens looks like a dark, unblinking eye. The photographer is busy mixing his plates. He is a man of science and art. But his subject today is not a wealthy banker posing for a portrait. It is not a debutante in her first ball gown. Seated on a small velvet chair is a little girl, perhaps 4 years old. She is dressed in her Sunday best, a white lace dress, stiff with starch. Her hair is curled perfectly. She is holding a small porcelain doll in her lap. She is incredibly still. In the early days of photography, this was the hardest part. The exposure times were long. You had to sit frozen for minute after minute. If you moved, you became a blur, a ghost. But this little girl does not move. She does not blink. She does not breathe. She is dead. This is post-mortem photography, the art of the dead. Today, we find these images disturbing. We see them on the internet labeled as creepy. But to the Victorians, they were acts of love. You must remember, in the 19th century, death was a visitor who knocked on every door. Infant mortality was high. Tuberculosis, the white plague, took the young and the beautiful indiscriminately. A family might lose 3 or 4 children before they reached adulthood. And photography was new. It was expensive. Most people lived their entire lives without ever having their picture taken. So, when a loved one died, the family was faced with a terrible realization. If they buried the body now, the face would fade from their memory. They would have nothing left. No image, no trace. So, they called the photographer. He was the last line of defense against oblivion. He came to the house, or the family brought the body to the studio. And for 1 hour, they pretended. They pretended that death had not happened. They staged a final, frozen moment of life. The photographer's job was to create an illusion. He was a director of the deceased. He had tricks. If the eyes were closed, he might paint open eyes onto the eyelids, or later onto the photographic print itself. It gave the subject a glassy, staring look, a 1,000-yard stare that seems to look right through you. If the body was limp, he used props, the posing stand, a heavy iron stand with clamps that went around the waist or the neck, hidden behind the clothes. It held the body upright. It gave the spine a false rigidity. Sometimes the deception was subtler. He would pose the subject as if they were sleeping. The last sleep, they called it.
lying on a chaise lounge, hands folded peacefully, surrounded by flowers. These are the saddest ones. Because they look so peaceful, you almost expect them to wake up. And then there were the group shots, the living posing with the dead. Imagine the emotional weight of that moment. A mother holding her deceased infant in her lap. She has to sit perfectly still. She cannot cry. If she shakes with grief, the photo will be ruined. So she freezes. Her face becomes a mask of controlled sorrow. She stares into the lens, holding the cold weight of her child. The baby is sharp, focused, perfect, because the baby doesn't move. The mother is often slightly blurred, a fuzzy edge caused by the micro-movements of breathing, of living. It creates a strange reversal. The dead look more solid, more real than the living. In some photos, you can see a strange shape behind the child, a lump under a curtain, or a pair of hands gripping the side of the chair. This is the hidden mother, a parent draped in black fabric, holding the body up, trying to erase themselves from the frame, so that the memory is only of the child. They became human furniture, supporting the dead from the shadows. The chemical process itself added to the atmosphere, the daguerreotype, an image on a silver-plated copper sheet. It was fragile. You had to hold it at a certain angle to see the picture. It shimmered like a hologram. It felt magical, like you were holding a piece of a soul trapped in silver.
These photographs were not hidden away in dark drawers. They were displayed. They were put on the mantelpiece. They were carried in lockets. They were sent to relatives in the mail. "Here is little Albert," the letter would say. "Doesn't he look peaceful?" To the Victorian mind, this was the memento mori. Remember, you must die. But it was also a denial of death. It was a way to say, they are still here. They are still part of the family. In a world without video, without digital clouds, this physical object was the only proof of existence. If the house caught fire, this was the first thing you saved, not the jewelry, the silver plate, the ghost in the glass. But as the century turned, the practice faded. Healthcare improved, death became less common, or at least more hidden. It moved from the parlor to the hospital. Photography became cheap. Everyone had a Kodak camera. You press the button, we do the rest. We had thousands of photos of our children alive. We didn't need one of them dead. The post-mortem photo became taboo. It became gruesome. We started to fear the dead body, to hide it away, to sanitize it. The idea of propping up a corpse in a chair became the stuff of nightmares, not love. But look closely at those old sepia images. Look past the stiffness, past the painted eyes. Look at the hands of the living people in the frame. Look at how gently they hold the subject. There is no horror there. Only heartbreak. These are not images of ghosts. They are the images of love frozen in time. They are the visible evidence of a love that refused to let go, even at the threshold of the grave. But while the photographer tried to capture the stillness of death, there were others in the Victorian era who were terrified of the opposite. They weren't afraid of the dead looking alive. They were afraid of the living looking dead. They were afraid of the mistake, the doctor who got it wrong, the heart that beat so slowly it couldn't be felt, the coma that looked like the end. And this fear led to one of the most claustrophobic inventions in history, the safety coffin, the bell that rings from 6 feet under.
We leave the silver-plated photographs of the parlour and we step outside, into the mist, into the place where the Victorians felt most comfortable and most terrified, the cemetery. It is night.
The fog is clinging to the headstones. The yew trees stand like silent sentinels. The air smells of wet earth, damp leaves and stone. It is quiet here, peaceful, or at least it should be. But in the 19th century, a new fear began to grip the public imagination. A fear so primal, so suffocating, that it kept sanity at bay. Taphophobia, the fear of being buried alive. It sounds like fiction to us, like a scene from a Poe story. But to the Victorians, it was a statistical possibility. Medicine was still blurry. The line between life and death was not as sharp as a monitor's beep. There were no grain scans, no EKGs. A doctor would hold a mirror to your mouth. If it fogged, you were alive. If it didn't, you were dead. But what if the doctor was wrong? Cholera, the great killer of the age, could put a patient into a deep, coma-like state. The skin would turn blue, the heart rate would drop so low it was imperceptible to the human touch. Opium, the favorite painkiller of the era, could slow the breathing to a shallow, ghostly rhythm. People read the newspapers. They saw the lurid headlines. Corpses found turned in their coffins, scratch marks on the inside of the lid, the shroud torn to shreds. Whether these stories were true or merely the result of decomposition gases moving the body didn't matter. The seed of terror was planted. Imagine the scenario. It is the stuff of nightmares. You drift off in a fever. You wake up expecting your bedroom, your pillow. Instead, you touch Saturn. You reach up and your hand hits wood. Hard, varnished wood, inches from your face. It is pitch black. The air is stale. You try to scream, but the sound is swallowed by the earth packed 6 feet above you. You are trapped in a box. You are alone, and you have been left there by the people who love you. This fear became an obsession. Wealthy men wrote clauses into their wills. "Cut my throat before you bury me," they would demand. "Drive a stake through my heart. Burn me." Anything to ensure that the sleep was permanent. But for the inventors of the age, fear was an opportunity. They didn't offer a stake through the heart. They offered a lifeline, a way to text from the grave. They invented the safety coffin.
The patent offices of Europe and America were flooded with designs. Between 1860 and 1890, nearly 100 patents were filed for life-preserving coffins. They ranged from the simple to the absurdly complex. But they all relied on the same principle: communication. Imagine the mechanism. You are placed in the coffin, but before the lid is screwed down, a string is tied to your finger, or perhaps placed in your hand like a bell pull. This string travels up, through a tube in the coffin lid, up through 6 feet of soil and emerges into the daylight. Attached to the top of the string, mounted on the headstone, is a bell, a simple brass bell. The idea was elegant. If you woke up, if you twitched, if you struggled, the string would pull. Above ground, in the silent graveyard, the bell would ring. Ding, ding, ding. A signal from the underworld. I am not dead. Come get me. Some designs were even more elaborate. The German Count Karnis Karnitsky invented a system where movement in the coffin didn't just ring a bell. It triggered a spring-loaded flag to shoot up. It turned on a lamp to illuminate the grave at night, and, crucially, it opened an air valve to allow fresh oxygen into the coffin, buying the occupant time until the gravediggers could arrive. There were coffins with glass windows, so the mourners could check for condensation. There were coffins with speaking tubes, allowing the buried person to shout for help. One American inventor even included a ladder, though how one was supposed to open the lid against the weight of the earth was never quite explained. It was a booming industry. Undertakers offered safety models for a premium price. For the anxious aristocrat,
It was the ultimate insurance policy. You could rest in peace knowing that if the peace was temporary, you had an exit strategy. But a machine is only as good as the person operating it, or in this case, the person listening to it. A bell ringing in a lonely graveyard at 3 in the morning is useless if there is no one there to hear it. So, the job of the cemetery watchman changed. He wasn't just guarding against body snatchers anymore, he was listening for ghosts.
Picture the watchman. He sits in a small wooden hut in the centre of the necropolis. He has a lantern. He has a bottle of gin to keep out the cold. And outside, in the rows of fresh graves, there are bells, dozens of them, waiting. The wind blows, a branch strikes a bell, clang! He jumps, he rushes out with his shovel, he puts his ear to the tube. Is it a voice, or is it the wind? Is it a life saved, or is it a cruel trick of the weather? The tragedy of the safety coffin is that, for all the patents, for all the money spent, there are almost no verified records of anyone actually being saved by one. The mechanism was flawed. Decomposition creates gas, the body swells, it shifts. A decaying arm might move just enough to pull a sensitive trigger. The bell rings, the family is summoned. The grave is dug up in a frenzy of hope, the lid is pried off, and inside they find only death. The movement was just physics. The bell was a false alarm. The horror of digging up a loved one only to find them rotting was often worse than the original grief. Eventually, the fad faded. Embalming became common, creating a certainty of death that no bell could rival. But the legacy of the safety coffin lingers in our language. We still say, "Saved by the bell." Now, historians argue about this. Most say it comes from boxing, but there is a part of us, the dark, superstitious part, that prefers the other story. The story of the string, the finger, and the brass chime in the night. It also gave us dead ringer, a person who looks exactly like someone else, or perhaps a person who rings the bell when they should be dead. The safety coffin stands as a monument to human anxiety. We are the only species that builds machines to rescue us from our own funerals. It shows how desperately we cling to life. We will build elaborate systems of pulleys and springs just to gain one more breath, one more chance to see the sun. But what if you didn't fear death? What if you feared what came after? What if your soul was heavy with sin and you had no time to confess? In the medieval village, there was a solution for that too. A human solution. A person who would take your darkness into themselves. We leave the ringing bells of the Victorian cemetery. We travel back to a quiet, lonely cottage on the edge of a Welsh village. We are looking for a man who is shunned, a man who lives in the shadows. We are looking for the sin-eater. The bell in the Victorian cemetery has stopped ringing. The fear of being buried alive fades as we move further back into the mist-shrouded hills of Wales, or perhaps the remote valleys of the Scottish Highlands. We travel to a time when the fear was not of the grave itself, but of what lay beyond it: purgatory, hell, the weight of a soul stained by sin. In the medieval and early modern village, death was a community event, but salvation, that was personal. And sometimes, if a person died suddenly, without a priest, without confession, there was a panic. The soul was heavy,
It was tethered to the earth by its transgressions. It could not fly. It would linger, haunting the family. Or worse, it would descend into the fire. So, when the doctor failed and the priest was too late, they sent for the outcast. They sent for the sin-eater. He does not live in the village. He lives on the edge, in a tumble-down shack near the woods or out on the bleak moorland. He is usually an old man, poor, ragged. Perhaps he was once a criminal, or simply a man born under a bad star. He is unclean. To touch him is bad luck. To look him in the eye is to invite misfortune. But tonight, the family needs him. A messenger runs to his door. "Come quickly," they say. "The master is gone." The sin-eater stands up. He wraps his tattered cloak around his shoulders. He grabs his wooden staff. He knows the ritual. He knows his price. A sixpence, a loaf of bread, a bowl of ale, and a soul's worth of darkness. He walks through the night. The villagers he passes turn their backs. They cross themselves. They pull their children inside. He is a necessary evil. Like the executioner or the gravedigger, he performs a function that society desperately needs, but despises. He is the spiritual sewage system of the parish. He arrives at the house of the dead. The windows are darkened. The mirrors are covered with black cloth, so the wandering spirit does not get trapped in the glass. The air smells of beeswax candles and grief. The family make way for him. They do not greet him. They shrink back against the walls, leaving a wide path. They are terrified of him, because he is about to become a vessel for the very thing they fear most.
He enters the room where the body is laid out. The deceased is pale, waxy, hands folded on his chest. It is quiet. The weeping has stopped. Everyone is watching the sin-eater. The ritual is simple, but heavy with symbolism. A loaf of bread, often a special crusty loaf baked just for this moment, is placed directly onto the chest of the corpse, right over the heart. It sits there, absorbing. The belief is that the sin, these spiritual miasma, rises from the body. It flows out of the dead heart and soaks into the bread, like ink into a sponge. The bread becomes heavy with the lies, the thefts, the anger, the lust, the envy of the dead man's life. All the unconfessed darkness is transferred into the grain. Next to the body, a bowl of ale is placed, sometimes made of maple wood, sometimes of pewter. The sin-eater steps forward. The room holds its breath. He reaches out a dirty, gnarled hand. He picks up the bread from the corpse's chest. He does not hesitate. He cannot. He takes a bite. Crunch. The sound is loud in the silent room. He chews. He swallows. He is eating the sin. He is taking the damnation of another man into his own gut. He drinks the ale to wash it down. As he finishes, he speaks the ancient words, the ease and rest incantation. His voice is raspy, unused to conversation. I give easement and rest now to thee, dear man. Come not down the lanes or in our meadows, and for thy peace I pawn my own soul. Amen. It is a transaction. He has sold a piece of his own eternity for a sixpence. He has added the dead man's burden to his own. The family visibly relaxes. The tension leaves the room. The soul is free. The ghost will not walk. The father or the brother is safe to go to heaven. But the cost remains in the room. It is standing there, wiping the crumbs from his grey beard. The sin-eater is now doubly cursed. He carries his own sins and the sins of the man on the table. He is saturated with evil. The family gives him the coin. They put it in his hand quickly, careful not to touch his skin. Then they drive him out. "Go," they shout, "be gone." They sometimes throw sticks or stones at him, chasing him away from the door. Not out of cruelty, but out of fear. He is a contagion. He must take the sin away, far away, back to the wilderness.
He walks back to his shack alone. The sixpence is cold in his pocket. The bread sits heavy in his stomach. Does he feel the weight of the sins? Does he feel the anger of the dead man rising in his own blood? Or does he just feel the fullness of a meal he rarely gets to eat? We will never know. The sin-eaters left no diaries. They were erased from history, mentioned only in folklore and the hushed whispers of the superstitious. The last known sin-eater, a man named Richard Munslow, died in Shropshire in 1906. With him, the ritual finally faded into the modern world. But the image of the sin-eater lingers. It is the ultimate expression of human loneliness, to be the one who saves others by damning yourself, to be essential yet reviled, to sit in the dark, eating the shadows of the world so that others can live in the light. And so, our journey comes to an end. We have walked the perfumed halls of Versailles and smelt the filth beneath. We have climbed the everlasting staircase of the treadmill. We have unwrapped the mummies of kings and heard the bells ringing in the graveyard. And finally, we have stood in the shadows with the lonely eater of sins. History is not just dates and battles. It is the story of how we coped with the cold, with the dirt, with the pain, and with the terrifying silence of death. We built machines, we brewed potions, we invented rituals, all to make the darkness a little less frightening. As you lie here tonight, safe in your bed, clean, warm, and free of pain, take a moment to appreciate the silence. It is not the silence of the tomb. It is not the silence of the separate system prison. It is the silence of peace. The past is a fascinating place to visit, but it is a hard place to live. Let us leave the ghosts to their rest. The sin-eater has done his work. The slate is wiped clean. Thank you for walking this long, dark path with me tonight. If these stories helped you drift away, please, before you fall asleep, touch the like button. It helps the channel more than you know. And consider subscribing to join us for the next journey into the shadows. Sleep well, my friends. The night is yours, and the history books are closed. Good night.